They would later give her a name, a designation whispered on encrypted channels and in the hushed archives of Strategic Command. But on that day, at Forward Operating Base Ethelgard, she was just the woman the general struck. He was a man of brass and bluster, a creature of hierarchy and noise. She was a being of silence and data, a quiet analyst who spoke the language of deep rock and resonant frequencies. The general hit her in front of 302 soldiers, a final desperate act of dominance. Seconds later, the mountain stopped screaming. The world fell silent, and in that profound quiet, everyone understood the difference between power and authority. The air at 13,000 feet was a knife. It was thin and cruel, stealing breath and warmth with indifferent efficiency. FOB Ethelgard was a wound scraped into the flank of the Zoria Tenzin Massif, a temporary city of reinforced canvas and hardened composites clinging to a granite shelf like a desperate lichen. The mountains surrounded it, a serrated, unbroken wall of knives pointed at the bruised purple sky. They were not majestic, they were menacing. Their geology was a nightmare of fractured strata and seismic tension, a place that was never truly still. The wind was the only constant, a low, mournful pressure that vibrated through the guy lines and tent poles, a sound that felt older than human conflict. Inside the cramped confines of the geospatial intelligence module, a different kind of vibration held sway. It was a low, subaudible hum, the collective voice of a dozen geophones planted deep in the permafrost, each one a nerve ending for the woman who watched over them. Dr. Aris Thorne sat before a tripartite holographic display, her form a study in stillness. The light from the projections painted shifting patterns of azure and emerald across her face, catching in the subtle silver threads at her temples. She wore no uniform, only gray thermal fatigues and a worn fleece jacket, a civilian anomaly in this ecosystem of camouflage and rank. Her focus was absolute. Her world contracted to the shimmering lines that scrolled across the central display. They were seismograms, the heartbeat of the mountain rendered in jagged, luminous script. To the soldiers who occasionally glanced into her isolated module, she was an oddity, the rock doctor brought in for reasons no one quite understood. They saw a woman staring at squiggles. Eris saw a conversation. She was listening to the strain. Her fingers, long and pale, rested on the cool metal of the console, not typing, but feeling the faint thrum that traveled through the module's frame. It was a secondary source of data, a physical confirmation of the digital feed. The mountain was speaking in a language of microfractures and subtle resonance shifts. For weeks, she had been building a library of its lexicon. There was the deep, grumbling bass of glacial meltwater, carving new paths through ancient fissures miles below. There was the sharp, percussive pop of thermal stress fracturing surface rock as the brutal day-night temperature differential did its work. These were the normal sounds, the background noise of a geologically active range. But for the past 72 hours, a new voice had joined the chorus. It was a whisper, a faint, rhythmic pulse that did not belong. It was too regular, too consistent. It had the signature of artificiality, a harmonic that nature, in all its chaotic grandeur, rarely produced. Her mind worked like a signal processor, filtering out the ambient noise, isolating the anomaly. She cross-referenced the signal's propagation path with the base's known tunnel detection sonar, finding nothing. The signal was too deep, its frequency too low for the standard acoustic sensors to even register. It wasn't the sound of digging, it was the sound of tuning. She felt a cold knot form in her stomach, a sensation that had nothing to do with the altitude. Someone was playing the mountain like an instrument. They were finding its resonant frequency, the specific vibration that could turn billions of tons of solid rock into a weapon. She ran a predictive model, the display on the left flickering with complex differential equations. The results were stark. A sustained broadcast at the correct amplitude and frequency would not just cause a rock slide. It would induce a state of liquefaction in the stratified layers beneath the base itself. Athelgard would not be buried, it would be swallowed. A klaxon blared outside, sharp and intrusive, followed by the percussive thud of heavy boots on the metal gangways. A wave of disruption washed over the base, a change in the human element that was as palpable as a shift in barometric pressure. Eris did not look up. Her focus remained on the anomalous harmonic, which had just stabilized, its frequency locking into a terrifyingly pure sine wave at 11.38 hertz. It was the key, the perfect, terrible key to unlock the mountain's fury. Her fingers moved then, flying across the console with an economist's precision. She wasn't just observing anymore, she was calculating a response. She began routing data streams, building a new kind of map, one not of terrain, but of geological stress and harmonic potential. The right-hand display, previously dark, bloomed to life with a three-dimensional lattice model of the massif, glowing veins of color indicating structural weaknesses and dense, stable rock formations. She was mapping the counter-argument. The door to her module slid open with a pneumatic hiss that made her flinch. The disruption was no longer outside. It was here, a wall of noise and ego that filled the small space. "This is it? This is the science division?" The voice was a blunt instrument, a baritone accustomed to filling parade grounds, not confined spaces. It was a voice that expected echoes and received them. Eris slowly turned her head. General Marcus Valerius stood in the doorway, a monument to military certainty. He was a large man. His dress uniform stretched taut over a broad chest, adorned with a galaxy of ribbons that told a story of conventional battles won through conventional means. His face was a mask of chiseled impatience, his jaw set, his eyes sweeping over her and her equipment with undisguised contempt. He was flanked by two aides, lieutenants who stood ramrod straight, their expressions carefully neutral, reflecting their commander's disdain like polished mirrors. "This is the Geospatial Intelligence Module, General," Eris replied, her voice quiet, a stark contrast to his boom. It was a simple statement of fact, stripped of inflection. Valerius stepped inside, his presence seeming to suck the very air from the module. He gestured dismissively at the shimmering displays. "And what precisely is the intelligence you're gathering here, Dr. Thorne? The migratory patterns of pebbles? I've been briefed on your little project, a colossal waste of strategic funds. We are in a war zone, not a university geology department." He said the word doctor as if it were an epithet, a term for something soft and useless. Eris turned back to her console. The 11.38 hertz signal remained, a steady, malevolent hum in the data. "I am monitoring the structural integrity of the massif and its relationship to anomalous seismic activity," she stated, her eyes tracing the sine wave. "Anomalous seismic activity," Valerius scoffed, moving to stand behind her, looming. He radiated a field of self-importance. "We have sappers and engineers for structural integrity. We have signals intelligence for anomalous activity. What we don't have is the time or the budget for academic navel-gazing. This base is here to project force, to find and eliminate the enemy. Your work does not contribute to that mission. It is a distraction. Her focus did not waver. Your sappers measure surface stability, General. Your SIGINT officers listen for radio waves. I am listening to the bedrock, and it is telling me that we are in imminent danger. A sharp, ugly laugh escaped Valerius's lips. Imminent danger? Doctor, I have been in more imminent danger than you have had hot meals. The danger here is out there. He jabbed a thick finger towards the viewport showing the jagged peaks. And I deal with it with firepower and manpower, not with charts. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl meant to intimidate. I am shutting this down. The resources allocated to you will be reassigned to my tactical teams. You and your machines will be on the next transport out of here. Pack your rocks and go home. Eris did not respond immediately. She watched the data stream, her mind a whirlwind of calculations. The amplitude of the enemy's signal was beginning to fluctuate, a testing pattern. They were probing, getting ready for the main event. She had hours, perhaps only one. Her leaving was not an option. It was a death sentence for every one of the 302 souls on this mountain. Her duty was not to the general's ego, but to the mission's survival, and survival depended on the data he refused to see. She finally turned to face him, her expression unreadable. No, General, I will not. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with disbelief. The two aides visibly tensed. General Valerius's face, already florid from the altitude, darkened to a deep, dangerous crimson. He was a man for whom an order given was an order obeyed. The concept of refusal from a civilian, a woman, a doctor, was not just insubordination. It was a violation of the natural order of his universe. "What did you just say to me?" he asked, his voice deceptively soft, a low rumble that promised a storm. "Your assessment of the threat is incomplete," Eris said, her tone clinical, as if explaining a complex variable to a slow student. "Therefore, your order is based on flawed premises. Executing it would compromise the safety of this entire command. My operational mandate, as per Directive 7 Alpha from Strategic Command, grants me final authority on all matters pertaining to geological and resonant threats. Your order is noted, and it is overruled." She had invoked the one thing he might, on some level, respect: a higher authority. But the casual, almost bored way she did it, the sheer audacity of it, pushed him past the brink of military decorum into the red territory of pure rage. He saw not a strategic asset exercising her authority, but a subordinate humiliating him in front of his own men. "Directive 7 Alpha?" he snarled, stepping so close she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "I am the commander of this theater. My authority is absolute. There is no directive that supersedes my command on my own base. You are a civilian contractor with delusions of grandeur. You are finished here." He turned to his aides. "Get her out of this chair. Confine her to her quarters. I want this module stripped and its power diverted to the main comms array in 1 hour." The aides exchanged a flicker of an uncertain glance, but moved to obey. Eris did not resist. She simply held the general's furious gaze, her own eyes calm and analytical. It was like watching a star collapse. The pressure of his own ego was becoming too great for his command authority to contain. He was going nova, and in that moment she was not afraid. She was merely observing a predictable, if violent, chemical reaction. The mountain was not the only unstable thing at Ephab Ethelgard. The briefing tent was an arena of controlled tension. It smelled of ozone, sweat, and the faint, metallic tang of fear. A large holographic map of the Zoraya Tenzin range dominated the center of the room, a slowly rotating ghost of rock and ice. Around it stood the command staff of FOB Ethelgard, majors, captains, and senior NCOs, their faces etched with fatigue, their postures rigid with military discipline. They were the cogs in General Valerius's war machine, competent and focused within the parameters he defined. At the head of the table, Valerius himself presided, a thundercloud of a man, his mood poisoning the atmosphere. Aris stood at the back of the tent, near the entrance flap, flanked by the 2 young military police Valerius had assigned to escort her. She was not in confinement. An urgent, encrypted message from Captain Eva Rostova, the base's sharp and observant chief of signals, had intercepted that order. Rostova had cited a minor protocol infraction regarding civilian contractors and managed to delay the general's command, requesting Aris's presence at the briefing to clarify her operational status. It was a clever bureaucratic maneuver, a small shield of red tape, and Aris understood it for what it was, an act of intellectual curiosity, if not outright alliance. Rostova had seen something in Aris's data, or perhaps in her quiet defiance, that resonated with her own logical mind. Valerius began the briefing, his voice echoing with manufactured confidence. He outlined patrol routes, analyzed enemy troop movements based on drone surveillance, and allocated resources for a series of planned offensives. It was a masterclass in conventional warfare doctrine. His strategy was sound, his logic impeccable, provided the enemy played by the same rules. He spoke of terrain as an obstacle to be overcome, a thing to be crossed or tunneled through. He never once spoke of it as a medium, as an active participant in the conflict. To him, the mountains were just the board on which the game was played. After detailing the tactical deployment for the next 24 hours, he paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled officers. Then his eyes found Aris at the back of the tent. A cruel smile touched his lips. It was time for the public humiliation. "And that brings me to a final point of order," he announced, his voice taking on a tone of magnanimous condescension. "We have a guest with us, a Dr. Thorne. She is a geologist, sent here by some well-meaning but misguided souls at Stratcom to, and I quote, assess anomalous seismic activity." He let the words hang in the air, allowing the absurdity, as he saw it, to sink in. A few of the officers shifted uncomfortably. They smelled blood in the water. "Now, I believe in a multidisciplinary approach," he continued, the lie smooth and practiced. "Every perspective has value. So, in the spirit of intellectual curiosity, let's hear from the doctor. Explain to me, Dr. Thorne." He locked his eyes on her, his voice hardening into a direct challenge. "In front of my command staff, explain to all of us why my budget is being wasted on your rock collection, while my soldiers are facing a real enemy. Justify your existence here." The entire tent fell silent. Every officer turned to look at her. She was the outsider, the anomaly, placed on a stage she had not chosen, commanded to perform for the amusement and reaffirmation of the man who held all the apparent power. The 2 MPs beside her stiffened, caught in the crossfire of authority. Aris felt the weight of their collective gaze. It was a physical pressure, an expectation of either submission or a clumsy, failed defense. She took a moment, her mind processing the situation not as a personal attack, but as a tactical problem. He wanted to discredit her. He was using public shame as a weapon. A direct confrontation would be perceived as insubordination and ego. A timid defense would validate his assessment of her as weak and useless. Neither was an acceptable outcome. The mission required that they listen, not to her, but to the data. Therefore, she had to become a conduit for that data, devoid of emotion, devoid of ego. She took a single step forward, out of the shadows by the tent flap. The movement was small but deliberate, drawing focus. She met the general's glare without blinking. "My work is not concerned with the enemy you are facing, General," she began, her voice calm and carrying easily in the sudden quiet. It was not loud, but it was clear, like a bell tone in a storm. "It is concerned with the weapon they are about to use." A murmur went through the officers. Valerius's eyes narrowed. This was not the stammering defense he had expected. "A weapon? We have no intelligence suggesting a new enemy weapon system. Our surveillance is total." "Your surveillance looks for heat signatures, radio emissions, and kinetic projectiles," Eris stated simply. "You are looking for things that go bang. The weapon I am referring to does not go bang. It hums." She paused, letting that strange word settle. "For the last 78 hours, an artificial resonance has been broadcast into the Zoraya Tenzin Massif. The source is heavily shielded and located miles away, deep underground. It is not a signal meant for communication. It is a tool. The frequency of this resonance has been slowly refined, sweeping through a spectrum until 90 minutes ago it locked onto a specific value, 11.38 hertz. She saw a flicker of understanding in Captain Rostova's eyes. The signals officer knew the significance of a locked frequency. It was the moment before transmission became action. "This value," Eris continued, her voice remaining level, analytical, "is the primary resonant frequency of the specific gneiss and schist strata upon which this base is built. The enemy has not been digging tunnels. They have been taking the pulse of the mountain. They have found its resonant key. When they increase the amplitude of this broadcast, the resulting sympathetic vibration will not be a simple earthquake. It will be a wave of shearing force, a sustained oscillation designed to induce stratum liquefaction. The ground beneath our feet will lose its cohesion. The foundations of this base will fail, and we will sink into the rock." She stopped, her explanation complete. She had presented the data, not an opinion. The silence in the tent was now of a different quality. It was no longer the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of confusion, of men trained to think in terms of ballistics and battle lines, trying to comprehend a threat from a domain they had never considered. The idea was alien, something from science fiction, not a military briefing. General Valerius stared at her, his face a thunderous mask of fury. She had not only defied him, she had pivoted his public shaming into a lecture on physics, hijacking the narrative and planting a seed of doubt in his command. She had made him look unprepared, ignorant. "Stratum liquefaction?" He finally spat the words, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "That is the most absurd, pseudo-scientific fantasy I have ever heard. You have no proof, no source, no weapon, nothing but squiggly lines on a screen and a vivid imagination. You think the enemy has a magic flute that will make the mountains swallow us whole?" He laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "You are not just irrelevant, Doctor. You are hysterical." He turned back to his officers, his authority reasserted through ridicule. "This is what happens when we allow civilians into a war zone. They lose their nerve. They see ghosts in the static. The briefing is over. Return to your duties. The planned operations proceed as scheduled." He waved a dismissive hand at her. "MPs, take her to her quarters. She is a distraction we can no longer afford. But as the officers began to file out, their expressions a mixture of relief and unease, Aris spoke one last time, her voice quiet but cutting. "The mountain is speaking, General. I am translating. You are choosing not to listen." Her words followed him as he strode from the tent, a final unanswered statement of fact. She had not won the argument. She had not changed his mind, but she had delivered the warning. The data was now in the system, logged in the minds of his staff. And as Captain Rostova passed her on the way out, she gave a barely perceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement. The translation had been received. The choice was no longer Eris's to make. It was theirs. The crisis did not arrive with a bang. It began as a tremor, a faint, almost imperceptible vibration under the soles of their boots. It felt, at first, like a heavy vehicle rumbling past, a common enough sensation on the bustling base. But it did not fade. It grew. It was a physical manifestation of the 11.38 Hz signal she had warned them about, the abstract data made terrifyingly real. The hum was no longer confined to her sensors. It was in the air, in their bones, a high-frequency thrum that set teeth on edge and made the fillings in their molars ache. Aris was in her small, sterile quarters, the two MPs standing guard outside her door when it started. She felt it first in a cup of water on her small desk. The surface, previously still, began to tremble, concentric ripples spreading from the center, a perfect physical representation of the sine wave assaulting the mountain. She closed her eyes, her mind instantly connecting the physical sensation to the data she knew was flooding her unmanned console. The amplitude was increasing. The probe was over. The attack had begun. Outside, a low rumble escalated into a grinding roar. It was not the sound of an explosion, but the sound of the world coming apart at its seams. A spiderweb of cracks raced across the permacrete floor of her quarters. A fine dust of pulverized rock began to sift down from the ceiling panels. The single light fixture flickered, then died, plunging her into darkness illuminated only by the red glow of an emergency power strip. The shouts started then, cries of alarm and confusion from the corridor, the heavy thud of running feet, the screech of stressed metal. The entire base was a drum, and something was beating upon it with a relentless, invisible hammer. The MPs outside her door were yelling, their voices tight with panic. "What is it, an earthquake?" one shouted over the din. "It's not stopping," yelled the other. Eris was calm. Her mind, insulated by years of analytical discipline, bypassed fear and went straight to diagnosis. This was not a chaotic, natural quake. This was controlled. It was a weapon of siege and denial. The initial shock would cause panic and structural damage, but the true goal was the sustained vibration, the slow, methodical destruction of the base's foundations. Valerius would be reacting to the symptoms, not the cause. He would be fighting the shaking, not the wave. In the command and control tent, chaos reigned. The central holographic map flickered violently, its image distorting as the projector struggled to compensate for the shaking. Officers stumbled, grabbing onto tables for support. Reports flooded in over the comms, a frantic cacophony of damage assessments. "Hangar 4 roof is collapsing. The main runway is fracturing. We have multiple casualties on the eastern perimeter wall." General Valerius stood in the center of the maelstrom, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. This was an attack he could not see, an enemy he could not shoot. His entire worldview, built on the principles of overwhelming firepower and tactical maneuver, was being rendered obsolete in real time. "Find the source," he bellowed, his voice barely audible over the grinding roar of the mountain. "I want every drone in the air, full sensor sweeps. I want artillery coordinates for every suspected enemy position within 100 kilometers. We will level them." His orders were the desperate thrashing of a drowning man. Drones were launched, only to have their sensitive electronics scrambled by the intense, low-frequency field, their video feeds dissolving into static before they crashed. Artillery crews, fighting to stay on their feet, aimed their massive guns at coordinates supplied by frantic guesswork, firing shells that exploded harmlessly against distant hillsides. The shelling had no effect on the vibration, but the massive recoil of the heavy guns, the kinetic shock transferred into the already unstable ground, had a disastrous one. On the holographic display, a new series of red warning icons bloomed to life near the artillery emplacements. "Sir!" an engineer screamed over the noise, pointing at the display. "The recoil from the M777S is accelerating the fracturing. We're making it worse." Valerius's face contorted. His own weapons were betraying him. His strength was being turned into a weakness. "Get the engineers to the foundations," he commanded, shifting to a new, equally futile tactic. "Reinforce the main supports for the C&C and the medical bay. I want every structural brace we have deployed now." It was another catastrophic failure of logic. The engineers, brave and disciplined, raced to obey, attempting to weld steel braces onto supports that were vibrating so intensely the metal glowed cherry red at the contact points. They were trying to patch a ship's hull while the ocean itself was dissolving. The problem wasn't that the supports were weak. It was that the ground they were anchored to was turning to gravel. Each new vibration, whether from the enemy's weapon or their own frantic movements, fed the cycle, hastening their own demise. The failure of orthodoxy was total and absolute. Every tool in the general's arsenal, firepower, engineering, aggressive action, was not only ineffective, but actively counterproductive. He was punching the water, trying to command a hurricane to stand down. Back in the dark corridor, Aris listened to the unfolding disaster. She heard the general's frantic, useless orders crackling over the MP's handheld radios. She heard the reports of accelerating structural failure. She knew, with chilling certainty, that the base had minutes, not hours. The moment of choice had passed. The moment for action was here. She moved to the door and pushed. It was jammed, the frame warped by the stress on the module. "Let me out," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "Ma'am, we're under orders to keep you here," one of the young men shouted back, his voice strained. "Your orders were given by a man who is currently destroying this base," Aris replied, her tone devoid of panic. "His methods are amplifying the resonance. Listen to the comms. The engineers are reporting that his actions are making it worse. In approximately 12 minutes, the C&C tent will collapse, followed by the medical bay. Your general will be dead, and so will everyone else. The only way to stop this is to counter the wave. And the only person on this mountain who knows how is in this room. Open the door." Her logic was a shard of ice in the hot chaos. The two MPs looked at each other, their faces pale in the emergency lighting. They were caught between the collapsing world around them and the absolute certainty in her voice. One of them, the younger one, made a decision. He slammed his shoulder against the door, adding his weight to hers. The warped metal groaned, then shrieked as the lock gave way. Aris stepped out into the swaying, dust-filled corridor. The noise was immense, a physical assault. She did not hesitate. She began moving towards the source of the chaos, towards the C&C tent, her steps steady and purposeful amidst the lurching and falling of those around her. She was no longer a civilian consultant. She was the only viable solution, and she was walking toward the heart of the problem. The command and control tent was a portrait of systemic failure. Screens flashed red with warnings, equipment had toppled from tables, and the very air was thick with rock dust and the electric smell of failing systems. The floor bucked and shuddered, a deck in a hurricane. In the center of it all, General Valerius stood, his face ashen, his uniform stained with dust, yelling orders that no one could effectively follow. He was a king screaming at an earthquake, his authority a hollow echo. The collective paralysis was palpable. His staff, trained to obey, continued to execute commands they knew were futile, their discipline a form of slow suicide. Then she entered. Eris Thorne walked through the torn entrance flap, a calm center in the swirling chaos. She moved with an unnatural grace, her body seemingly compensating for the violent lurches of the ground beneath her. All eyes, drawn by the stark contrast of her composure, turned to her. The general saw her, and his face, already a mask of fury and failure, twisted into a snarl of pure hatred. She was the embodiment of his humiliation, the Cassandra whose prophecy was coming true in the most destructive way imaginable. "You!" he roared, pointing a trembling finger. "I gave you an order. Get her out of here." But no one moved. The MPs who had been at her door were gone, swallowed by the chaos. The officers in the tent were frozen, looking from their failing commander to the strange, quiet woman who had predicted this exact disaster. In that moment of hesitation, authority began to shift. It was not seized. It flowed, draining from the man who was yelling and pooling around the woman who was silent. Eris ignored him. Her gaze was fixed on the main tactical display, which now showed a catastrophic cascade of structural failure alerts. Her mind was a cold engine of logic, processing the variables. The resonance wave, the failing structures, the counterproductive actions of the base personnel. She had the solution. It was elegant, dangerous, and entirely counterintuitive, and it required absolute control. She walked to the master command console, the nerve center of the entire base. Captain Rostova was there, her knuckles white as she gripped the table, trying to route failing communication links. Eris placed a hand on the console. "Give me the network," she said, her voice quiet but absolute. Rostova looked up, her face streaked with grime. She saw no panic in Eris's eyes, only an unnerving depth of focus. She saw the answer. "What are you doing?" Valerius bellowed, stumbling towards them. "I am in command here. I give the orders." Eris turned to face him, her expression flat, her eyes like chips of flint. "Your orders are compromising the structural integrity of this base and accelerating its destruction," she stated, her voice cutting through the din. "You are amplifying the destructive wave. From this moment, you will be silent." She then turned to the assembled staff, her voice rising just enough to command the room. "Cease all heavy vehicle movement. Power down all non-essential systems to minimize secondary EM interference. All artillery crews, stand by for new fire control data. You will not be targeting the enemy. You will be targeting the mountain." The order was insane, suicidal. To fire artillery at their own location in the middle of a seismic event? But it was delivered with such unshakable authority that it broke the spell of Valerius's command. This was the final affront to the general's ego, the public usurpation of his power by the woman he had tried to break. He lunged, his face contorted in a mask of primal rage. It was not the calculated action of an officer. It was the blind swing of a cornered animal. His fist, large and heavy with the weight of a signet ring, connected with the side of her face. The sound of the impact was shockingly intimate amidst the greater roar, a wet, solid crack. Eris's head snapped to the side. A dark bruise began to bloom instantly on her cheekbone, and a thin trickle of blood ran from the corner of her mouth. 302 soldiers, the command staff in the tent, the guards at the perimeter, the engineers in the corridors, all linked by the open comms network, heard the sound or heard the gasps of those who saw it. They saw their general strike the civilian analyst. For a single, frozen second, the world held its breath. Eris did not cry out. She did not fall. She slowly, deliberately, turned her head back to face him. The analytical calm in her eyes was gone, replaced by something far colder, far more absolute. It was the look of a fundamental force that had been trifled with. She simply held his gaze. Then she turned back to the console. "Captain Rostova," she said, her voice perfectly even, betraying no pain, only purpose. "Give me fire control, now." That was the turn, the moment of fracture. Captain Rostova looked at the bleeding, bruised face of Dr. Thorne. She looked at the sputtering, impotent rage of her general. She looked at the failing screens that promised their imminent deaths. Her choice was between a hierarchy that was killing them and a logic that might save them. It was no choice at all. "Do it," Rostova commanded her subordinates at the signal station. "Patch her in. Slave the artillery fire control network to her terminal. Give her everything." The technicians, their faces a mixture of fear and awe, complied instantly. A new set of controls lit up on Eris's console. She had the guns. She had the network. She had the base. The general stood frozen, his fist still clenched, suddenly irrelevant. His power had vanished, not taken, but rendered meaningless in the face of true competence. He had struck her, and in doing so, had only cemented his own defeat. The quiet professional was now in command. Eris's fingers flew across the holographic interface. Data streams that had been chaotic and contradictory now flowed into a single, coherent model in her mind. She was not a soldier or a commander. She was a conductor standing before a dissonant, raging orchestra, and she was about to force it into harmony. The enemy's 11.38 Hz signal was the blaring, destructive horn section. Her instruments were the 6 M777 howitzers, positioned in a semicircle around the base. Her sheet music was the geological map of stress and density she had been preparing for days. Her solution was not one of brute force. It was one of sublime, lethal elegance. To fight a wave, you do not build a wall. You create a counterwave, destructive interference. It was a principle as old as physics itself. She needed to introduce a new set of vibrations into the mountain, precisely timed and targeted, that would be perfectly out of phase with the enemy's signal. The crest of her wave would meet the trough of theirs. The result would be nullification. Silence. "Artillery Battery Alpha, stand by for fire mission," she spoke into the command channel, her voice a blade of pure calm. "Targeting solution incoming. You will fire on my mark. Not before, not after. Exactly on my mark." In the artillery pits, the gun crews, who had been bracing against the shaking earth, stared at their targeting computers in disbelief. The coordinates flashing onto their screens were not miles away in enemy territory. They were for locations just a few hundred meters outside the base perimeter. They were being ordered to shoot at the ground beneath their own feet. "Command, please confirm target coordinates." The battery commander's voice crackled back, laced with panic. "These are danger close. These are inside our own perimeter." "Coordinates are confirmed, Battery Alpha," Eris replied, her eyes never leaving the complex waveform display. "You are not firing for effect. You are firing for resonance. Your target is not a position. It is a moment in time. Fire on my mark." She began the sequence. Her left hand danced across the control panel, isolating the firing mechanisms for each of the 6 guns, slaving them to a microsecond-accurate chronometer. Her right hand manipulated the 3D model of the mountain, highlighting the targets. She was not aiming for weak points. She was aiming for the opposite: massive, dense, stable formations of Precambrian granite, the ancient bones of the mountain. She would strike them like tuning forks, making them ring with a voice of her own choosing. "Gun 1, fire! Now!" A monstrous roar tore through the air, a physical blow that was deeper and more violent than the ambient shaking. A mile to the north, a 155mm shell, its fuse disabled, slammed into a solid wall of granite. The impact transferred a colossal amount of kinetic energy into the rock. On Eris's screen, a new wave bloomed, a vibrant purple line radiating outward from the point of impact. It was chaotic, but it was hers. "Gun 3, fire, now!" Another earth-shattering roar, this time from the southeast. A second shell struck a deep, subterranean batholith. Another purple wave erupted on her screen, intersecting the first. The enemy's signal, the relentless green scene wave, wavered for a fraction of a second as the new vibrations interfered with it. It was working. She was talking back to the mountain. She fell into a rhythm, a state of hyper-focused consciousness where the sea and sea tent, the bleeding cut on her face, and the stunned general faded into irrelevance. Her world was the interplay of waves, the mathematics of frequency and phase. She was a composer of kinetic energy. "Gun 5, now. Gun 2, now. Gun 6, now." The artillery fired in a strange arrhythmic sequence, a syncopated drumbeat of salvation. It was not a barrage. It was a carefully orchestrated performance. Each impact was a note, each note timed to the millisecond to build the counter-resonance. The purple waves on her screen merged, cohered, and transformed from chaotic ripples into a single, powerful, unified waveform. It was the mirror image of the enemy's signal, perfectly inverted. "All guns, fire, now!" She gave the final command. The 5 remaining shells, one gun was still reloading from the initial sequence, fired in a single, cataclysmic volley, each aimed at a different, carefully selected point. It was the crescendo, the final, massive injection of destructive interference. For one terrifying second, the shaking intensified tenfold. The entire mountain seemed to scream, a final, agonizing groan of tortured rock. The lights in the C&C tent exploded in a shower of sparks. The floor heaved violently, throwing everyone to the ground. General Valerius cried out, a thin, reedy sound of pure terror. And then silence. It was not a gradual fading. It was a sudden, absolute cessation. The grinding roar vanished. The high-frequency hum in their bones was gone. The violent shaking stopped as if a switch had been thrown. The world, which had been a screaming, vibrating hellscape, was suddenly, profoundly, unnaturally still. The silence was so deep, so complete, it was a physical presence. It pressed in on their eardrums. It was the sound of a fever breaking, the sound of a checkmate. In the aftermath, the only sound was the faint, tinkling rain of dust settling, and the ragged, disbelieving gasps of the survivors. Eris Thorne stood alone at her console, its screen now showing two lines, one green, one purple, that had merged and flatlined into a single, serene, horizontal bar. Nullification. The threat was neutralized. She reached up and touched her cheek, her fingers coming away stained with blood. She looked at her hand, then back at the silent screen, her expression once again unreadable, analytical. The unorthodox triumph was complete. Into the profound silence that had enveloped FOB Ethelgard, a new sound intruded. It was a burst of static, sharp and clear. From the comms console, Captain Rostova was still hunched over. The primary satellite link, knocked offline by the intense resonance field, had flickered back to life. A priority signal, one that had been hammering relentlessly at their disabled receivers, finally broke through. It was a high encryption, command-level channel, reserved for the highest echelons of the military. Ethelgard Command, this is Stratcom Actual, a new voice said, calm and authoritative, cutting through the static. We lost your telemetry during a high-energy event. Report status immediately. Is Cascade on this channel? I repeat, is Asset Cascade secure? The name dropped into the stunned quiet of the C&C tent like a lead weight. Cascade. It was not a standard military call sign. It was a code name, one whispered in the intelligence community with a kind of mythic reverence. It was a ghost, a designation attached to resolvings of impossible problems, a name linked to events that were later classified so deeply they ceased to exist. It was a legend, not a person. Captain Rostova, her training kicking in, fumbled for the transmit button. Stratcom. Actual, this is Ethelgard. We are secure. The event is over. Her voice was shaky. I do not have a Cascade on my roster, sir. General Valerius, who had picked himself up from the floor, stared at the comms unit, his face a mess of confusion, dust, and dawning horror. The voice on the other end belonged to General Sterling, the Supreme Commander of Strategic Command, a man Valerius had met only twice in his entire career, and he wasn't asking for him. Look again, Captain, Sterling's voice came back, tight with impatience. Civilian attachment, Dr. Eris Thorne. Is she operational? Every head in the tent swiveled towards Eris. She stood by her console, dabbing the cut on her cheek with the sleeve of her jacket, her attention seemingly more focused on the minor injury than on the conversation that was reordering their universe. Rostova looked at Eris, then back at her console. Sir, Dr. Thorne is here. She is operational. Put her on, Sterling commanded. Rostova held the receiver out to Eris, her hand trembling slightly. Eris took it, her movements economical. Thorne here, she said, her voice flat. Cascade, report. Sterling's voice lost its edge, replaced by a deep, palpable relief. What was the event? Our deep space arrays picked up a massive, focused energy broadcast, then a series of chaotic kinetic impacts, then nothing. The primary signal vanished. Resonance weapon, Eris replied, her explanation a masterpiece of brevity. Enemy broadcast at 11.38 Hz, targeting local stratum instability. I induced a destructive interference pattern using the base's organic artillery assets. The threat is neutralized. The weapon is nullified. There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a soft exhale. You used howitzers to create a phase cancellation wave, Sterling stated. Not a question, but a confirmation, as if he was the only other person in the world who could immediately grasp the insane brilliance of it. Of course you did. Casualties? Minimal, Eris said, mostly from secondary structural failures during the initial phase. The base is damaged, but intact. The command structure, however, is compromised. The final sentence was delivered with a cold, clinical precision, and her eyes flickered for a moment towards General Valerius. The implication was crystal clear to Sterling. Understood, he said, his voice hardening again. Put the ranking officer back on the line, the one who's not the theater commander. Eris handed the receiver back to Rostova. Stratcom Actual, Captain Rostova here, the captain said, her voice now steady. She had found her footing in this new, inverted reality. Captain Rostova. Sterling's voice was like a hammer striking steel. General Valerius attempted to remove Dr. Thorne from her post, did he not? Rostova swallowed hard. Yes, sir, he did. And did he at any point interfere with her ability to carry out her directive? Rostova glanced at the ugly, swelling bruise on Aris's face. The entire command staff followed her gaze. The collective memory of the slap, the sound, the shock filled the tent. Yes, sir, Rostova said, her voice ringing with conviction. He did. The silence from Stratcom was glacial. When Sterling spoke again, his voice was stripped of all emotion, leaving only the cold, hard edge of absolute command. General Marcus Valerius. He did not ask for him. He summoned him. Valerius, who had been standing frozen, a statue of his own obsolescence, stumbled forward and took the receiver from Rostova. His hand was shaking violently. Sterling, sir. General Valerius, you are a fool, Sterling began, his voice dangerously low but perfectly clear to everyone near the console. You were given custodianship of a Tier 1 strategic asset, a national resource whose function you could not begin to comprehend. Cascade is not a consultant. Cascade is a failsafe. Her authority in her specific domain, matters of existential, paradigm-shifting threat, is absolute. It supersedes theater command. It supersedes my command. That was in your briefing, General, in the sealed addendum you signed for but clearly never bothered to read. Valerius's face went white. The sealed addendum. He dismissed it as boilerplate for the weird civilian scientist. You had one job, Marcus, Sterling continued, his voice a relentless tide. To facilitate her work and stay out of her way. Instead, you obstructed her. You belittled her. And I hear, in the captain's voice, that you assaulted her. You valued your ego over the lives of 300 soldiers and a multi-billion-dollar strategic outpost. You have proven yourself not just incompetent, but a liability to the entire command structure. As of this moment, you are relieved of command. You will surrender your sidearm and any command credentials to Captain Rostova. You will be confined to your quarters under armed guard. You are silent from this moment until a transport arrives to take you to a court-martial that I will personally oversee. Is that understood? Valerius could not speak. He made a choking sound, a death rattle of a career. He nodded, a spastic, puppet-like gesture. I need a verbal confirmation, General. Sterling's voice was merciless. Yes, sir, Valerius whispered, the sound barely audible. The receiver slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering onto the console. He stood there for a long moment, his eyes vacant, seeing the ruin of his entire life. Then, with the slow, shuffling movements of a very old man, he unbuckled his sidearm and held it out to Captain Rostova. His fall from power was total, swift, and absolute. The man of noise had been silenced. A new order settled over FOB Ethelgard, one as profound and pervasive as the silence that had followed the storm. The frantic energy of Valerius's command was replaced by a quiet, focused efficiency. Captain Rostova, now in temporary command, moved with a newfound gravity, her orders crisp, logical, and centered on damage control and stabilization. The soldiers, NCOs, and officers, having witnessed the spectacular fall of one kind of authority and the undeniable rise of another, adapted with the pragmatism of professionals. The hierarchy had been decapitated, but the organism survived, finding a new brain. And at the center of this new reality was Eris Thorne. She was no longer the odd rock doctor. She was Cascade. The name was never spoken aloud, but it was present in the way soldiers parted to let her pass, in the way they averted their eyes, not out of disrespect, but out of a deep and unsettling awe. They looked at her the way ancient men might have looked at a shaman who could command the thunder. She had become a figure of myth, all the more potent for being flesh and blood, standing right there among them with a bruise on her face. She showed no pleasure in her victory, no satisfaction in Valerius's disgrace. Her vindication was not emotional, it was a mathematical proof. Her data had been correct, her solution had worked, there was nothing more to say. She returned to her geospatial intelligence module, rebooted the systems, and went back to work. A few hours later, as the thin light of dawn began to bleed over the jagged peaks, Captain Rostova found her there. Eris was staring at the seismographic displays again, which were now tracing the gentle, steady lines of a mountain at peace. The module was clean, the dust swept away, the equipment organized with a Spartan tidiness. Rostova hesitated at the door, a different person from the confident signals officer she had been just a day before. She was a commander now, but in this small room she felt like a student. She did not offer praise or thanks. Words like that felt small, inadequate. Instead, she held out a steaming mug. "Coffee," she said. "The water filters are back online." Eris took the mug, her fingers wrapping around its warmth. She took a slow sip, her eyes still on the screens. Rostova stepped fully into the module, standing beside her, looking at the incomprehensible lines on the display. She did not pretend to understand what she was seeing. She sought to. "The next resonance pattern," Rostova asked, her voice quiet, respectful. "The next time the mountain speaks, what should we be listening for?" It was the perfect question. It was not an appeal to magic, but a request for knowledge. It was the ultimate gesture of respect, an admission of ignorance and a desire to learn. Eris turned her head slightly, meeting the captain's gaze. A flicker of something, not a smile, but a kind of intellectual approval, passed through her cool, gray eyes. "The patterns are always there," Eris said. "The key is not to listen for a specific voice, but to understand the silence in between. That is where the anomalies hide." Her purpose at Ethelgard was fulfilled. The immediate threat was gone. The flawed command structure had been excised. A more competent, data-driven leader was in its place. Once the base was fully stabilized and a formal replacement for Valerius was inbound, she packed her small kit, a ruggedized laptop, a set of encrypted hard drives, and a few personal items. She wore the same gray thermal fatigues she had arrived in. Her only souvenir was the fading purple and yellow bruise on her cheek, a quiet testament to the friction between ego and evidence. She left as she had arrived, with no fanfare. A lone transport helicopter descended, its rotors kicking up a cloud of dust. Captain Rostova stood on the landing pad to see her off, offering a crisp, formal salute, which Iris acknowledged with a simple nod. As she boarded the helicopter and it lifted into the thin mountain air, she became a ghost once more. A quiet professional melting back into the vast, complex machinery of a world that needed her but would never truly understand her. She was Cascade, not a hero, for heroism requires an audience and an emotional stake. She was a function, as essential and as impersonal as gravity. Her legacy at FOB Ethelgard would not be a statue or a plaque. It would be a new way of listening. It would be the quiet acknowledgement in the minds of 302 survivors that the most profound power does not come from the rank on a collar or the volume of a voice. It comes from understanding the fundamental language of the world and knowing with absolute certainty how to answer when it speaks.